The harbor at St. Peter Port had become a living thing. It heaved and pulsed with humanity, a mass of bodies pressing toward the stone quays where ships groaned against their moorings. 21-year-old Thomas Lamoron stood at the entrance to the main pier. His volunteer marshal's armband already darkened with sweat despite the cool morning of June 21, 1940. The crowd surged forward again, mothers clutching children, elderly couples supporting each other. Everyone carrying whatever they could salvage from lives they were abandoning in a matter of hours. Behind them, the green fields of Guernsey stretched toward an uncertain future. Ahead, the gray waters of the English Channel offered the only path to safety. Thomas raised both arms above his head and shouted over the din. Not instructions, not orders, just a single sustained whistle, sharp and commanding, the same sound he had used 1,000 times to move his father's dairy herd from pasture to barn. The crowd hesitated. In that moment of stillness, Thomas saw what he needed to see. Panic barely contained, order collapsing, people about to be crushed. He had perhaps 5 seconds before the surge began again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 5 days earlier, Thomas Lamoron had been worried about tomatoes. His father's farm in the parish of Castell, 3 miles inland from St. Peter Port, had been preparing for the summer harvest. The greenhouse tomatoes were ripening early that year, and the Lamoron family, like most Guernsey farming families, depended on the export trade to Britain. Thomas had spent the morning of June 16 checking the plants, calculating yields, planning the lorry loads that would carry their crop to the harbor for shipment to English markets. The war, which had seemed distant for so many months, belonged to newspapers and wireless broadcasts. It was something happening in France, in Belgium, in places that existed on the other side of the water. By that afternoon, the war had crossed the channel, not with bombs or soldiers, but with a single telephone call to the island's lieutenant governor. The British government had made its decision. The Channel Islands would not be defended. The garrison troops were leaving. The islands were being demilitarized. And the civilian population had a choice to make: stay and face German occupation or evacuate to England with whatever they could carry. The news spread through Guernsey like fire through dry summer grass. Thomas heard it first from the postman, then from neighbors who appeared at the farm gate, then from his father, who returned from St. Peter Port with a newspaper that confirmed what everyone feared. The Channel Islands, British territory for more than 8 centuries, were being abandoned. Winston Churchill himself had reluctantly approved the decision. The islands offered no strategic value. The troops were needed elsewhere. The people were on their own. Guernsey in June of 1940 was an island of approximately 41,000 souls. Most lived in or near St. Peter Port, the capital, a picturesque harbor town of narrow streets and granite buildings that climbed the hillsides overlooking the sea. The rest of the population spread across the island's 24 square miles in a patchwork of farms and small villages. These were not wealthy people, though neither were they desperately poor. Guernsey's economy ran on agriculture, tomatoes primarily, but also dairy cattle, potatoes, and the seasonal work that came with market gardening. The men who worked the land understood weather and seasons and the rhythms of growing things. They understood animals and soil and the patient labor required to coax sustenance from the earth. Thomas Lamoron was one of these men, the eldest of 4 children. He had left school at 14 to work full-time on his father's farm. For 7 years, he had risen before dawn to milk the dairy herd. 23 Guernsey cows whose rich cream and butter supplied local shops and restaurants. He knew each cow by name and temperament. He knew how to move them calmly from field to milking shed, how to prevent the nervous ones from startling the others, how to guide a herd of large, powerful animals through narrow gates and along country lanes without chaos or injury. It was patient work, quiet work, work that required reading the mood of the group, anticipating problems before they emerged, positioning yourself where you were needed most. These were not skills that seemed relevant to war. Yet on the morning of June 19th, when Thomas volunteered to serve as a marshal at the evacuation assembly point, they would prove to be exactly what was needed. The decision to evacuate had come with almost no preparation. The government announcement on June 17th gave families less than 48 hours to decide whether to leave their homes, perhaps forever. There was no comprehensive plan, no established procedures, no clear guidance about who should go or how the process would work. The States of Deliberation, Guernsey's parliament, held emergency meetings. The island's leaders, including the elderly bailiff, Victor Carey, scrambled to organize something that had never been attempted before, the voluntary mass evacuation of half an island's population. Schools were designated as assembly points. Parents were told to register their children immediately. Teachers were informed they would be expected to accompany their students to England. Volunteer marshals were urgently recruited to help manage crowds at the harbor. Ships were being diverted from Operation Ariel. The desperate effort to evacuate British troops still trapped in France. These vessels would make what runs they could to Guernsey before the Germans arrived. No one knew exactly when the Germans would arrive. Intelligence reports were vague and contradictory. What everyone did know was that German forces had captured Cherbourg just 40 miles away across the water on June 19th. German aircraft could reach Guernsey in minutes. German invasion forces could arrive at any time. The window for evacuation was closing rapidly. Thomas registered as a volunteer marshal on June 18th at the St. Peter Port Town Hall. The registration officer, a harried civil servant who looked as though he hadn't slept in days, asked Thomas only 2 questions. Could he follow instructions? Could he handle a crowd? Thomas answered yes to both, though in truth he had never handled anything larger than his father's dairy herd and the occasional church gathering. The officer handed him an armband, told him to report to Pier Number 2 at 6 o'clock the following morning, and moved on to the next volunteer. That evening, Thomas sat with his family in the farmhouse kitchen. His mother had prepared supper, potato soup, and bread, but no one ate much. His father sat at the head of the table, turning a teacup in his hands, saying nothing. His 2 younger sisters, aged 16 and 13, had been crying on and off all day. His 12-year-old brother kept asking questions no one could answer. Would the Germans take the farm? Would they hurt the cows? When would the family see each other again? Because the Lamariant family was splitting up. Thomas's father had decided the younger children should evacuate with their mother. Thomas and his father would stay to manage the farm and the herd. Someone had to stay. The cows needed milking twice daily. The tomatoes would need harvesting. The land could not simply be abandoned. And beneath these practical considerations lay something deeper. The stubborn pride of men who had farmed this soil for generations and could not imagine leaving it to invaders. Thomas's mother tried to argue. How could she leave her husband and eldest son behind? How could she take the younger children to England with no family there, no home waiting, no knowledge of when or if they would return? But the decision had been made. The younger children needed to be kept safe. Thomas was old enough to stay. That was the end of it. The family said goodbye in the kitchen after supper. Thomas hugged his sisters, shook his brother's hand, and embraced his mother. They would leave for the harbor at first light. Thomas would report for his martial duties at the same time. They might see each other briefly at the evacuation point, or they might not. The chaos was too great to predict. Thomas slept poorly that night. He lay in his small bedroom under the farmhouse eaves, listening to the familiar sounds of the countryside, the lowing of cattle in the barn, the rustle of wind through the greenhouse glass, the distant bark of a farm dog. Tomorrow these sounds might be the last peaceful things he heard for a very long time. He rose at 4 o'clock in the morning on June 19th. The sky was already brightening. His father was in the barn doing the first milking. His mother and siblings were preparing for departure, gathering the few possessions they were allowed to take. Thomas dressed in his workclothes, sturdy trousers, a cotton shirt, heavy boots, and pinned a volunteer marshal's armband to his sleeve. Then he walked the 3 miles to St. Peter Port, arriving as the town was waking to the strangest day in its long history. The harbor was already crowded when Thomas reported to his assigned position at 6 o'clock. Families had been arriving since before dawn, many having walked miles from outlying parishes with their children and their bundles of belongings. The assembly process was supposed to be orderly. Register at designated points. Wait for your assigned group to be called. Proceed to the correct pier when instructed. But order was a fragile thing that morning. Fear moved through the crowd like a contagion. Rumors spread faster than officials could contradict them. Some said ships were limited and not everyone would get away. Others said German planes had been spotted. Still others insisted the evacuation was a mistake, that those who left would never be allowed to return. Thomas took his position at Pier Number 2 alongside a dozen other volunteer marshals. Their supervisor, a retired police sergeant named Furbrash, gave them hasty instructions. Keep the crowd calm. Prevent pushing. Ensure people board in an orderly fashion. Watch for families being separated. Look out for elderly or disabled evacuees who might need assistance. Above all, prevent panic. A panicked crowd could crush people, could overwhelm the piers, could turn evacuation into catastrophe. The first ship arrived at 7:30. It was a cross-channel ferry requisitioned and hastily converted for passenger transport. It could carry perhaps 600 people if packed tightly. There were already more than 2,000 people in the immediate harbor area, with more arriving every minute. The mathematics were brutal and obvious. Not everyone would leave today. Perhaps not even half. When the gangway was lowered, the crowd pressed forward. Sergeant Fabris shouted for order. The marshals linked arms to form a barrier, but the pressure from behind was immense. Mothers screamed for their children. Elderly people stumbled. Someone fell. Thomas saw it happening in slow motion. Order collapsing into chaos. Organization dissolving into mob psychology. Safety giving way to tragedy. And in that moment, something in Thomas's mind shifted. He stopped seeing a crowd of people. He started seeing a herd, a frightened herd that needed to be moved carefully, steadily, without panic. He knew how to do this. He had done it 1,000 times. He stepped away from the marshal line and positioned himself where the crowd could see him. He raised both arms and he whistled. Noise, sharp, commanding, familiar to anyone who had ever worked with animals or lived near farms. The crowd hesitated just for a second. In that second, Thomas pointed to a group of mothers with young children near the front. "You 10, he called out, his voice carrying across the pier. "Form a line, single file. Follow me to the gangway. Everyone else, stay where you are. You'll board next." To his amazement, they listened. The 10 mothers gathered their children and formed a line. Thomas led them to the gangway, walking slowly, keeping them together, maintaining calm. When they were safely aboard, he returned for the next group. "You families there," he called, pointing to a cluster of people on the left. "Form up behind these folks. You're next." Everyone else will get to you. Every ship takes everyone it can. Stay calm and you'll all get aboard. It wasn't entirely true. Thomas had no way of knowing how many ships would come or how many people would actually evacuate. But the port lie was necessary. Panic would kill people. Order would save them. And order required confidence, even false confidence in those managing the crowd. Sergeant Ferber saw what Thomas was doing and immediately grasped its value. He began directing other marshals to do the same. Break the mass into manageable groups. Move them systematically. Keep everyone occupied with specific instructions. Waiting was unbearable, but waiting with purpose, knowing your group would be called next or the group after was tolerable. The ferry loaded throughout the morning. By noon, it departed with every available space filled, carrying approximately 700 people toward Weymouth. Thomas had helped load at least 200 of them. His voice was from shouting. His arms ached from directing traffic, but the pier had remained orderly. No one had been crushed. No one had been left behind who should have boarded. It was, under the circumstances, as much as anyone could hope for. The second ship arrived in the early afternoon. Then a third, then more. Some were proper passenger fees. Others were cargo ships hastily converted with makeshift accommodations. One was a coal steamer, filthy and unsuitable, but evacuees boarded it anyway because any ship leaving Guernsey was better than remaining. As the day wore on, the crowd at the harbor swelled rather than diminished. Word spread through the island that ships were sailing. Families who had decided to stay changed their minds. People from distant parishes arrived after long walks, carrying whatever they could manage. By evening there were more people at the harbor than there had been at dawn. Thomas worked through the afternoon and into the evening, managing his section of pier, learning as he went. He discovered that elderly people moved more calmly if given specific tasks, holding children's hands, watching bundles, counting their group. He found that keeping families together prevented most problems. Separated, parents became frantic, but intact families stayed composed. He realized that people would follow almost any instruction if delivered with confidence, even if the instruction was arbitrary. You 15 people, your group 7, wait here. You'll board after group 6. It didn't matter that the groups were invented on the spot. What mattered was structure, purpose, the feeling that someone was in control, even when control was largely an illusion. By nightfall on June 19th, approximately 3,000 people had evacuated from Guernsey. The harbor finally quieted as darkness made further departures too dangerous. Ships would resume at dawn. Thomas stumbled back through the dark streets toward Castell. Every muscle aching, his voice reduced to a rasp. His mother and siblings had evacuated that afternoon on the fourth ship. He had seen them briefly in the crowd, long enough to embrace his mother one final time, long enough to promise his sisters he would be safe, long enough to watch them disappear up a gangway onto a vessel bound for England and uncertainty. Then he returned to his position and continued working. There were still people who needed to leave, and someone had to help them do it. June 20th dawned, gray and cool. Thomas returned to the harbor at 5 o'clock in the morning, joining Sergeant Ferbrache and the other volunteer marshals, who had reported for another day of evacuation duty. The sergeant pulled Thomas aside before the crowds arrived. "You did good work yesterday, Laurent, better than most. I want you on the main pier today. That's where the big ships dock, where we'll move the most people. Think you can handle it?" Thomas nodded. His throat was still raw from shouting, but he could manage. He took his position at Pier 1 as the first evacuees began arriving in the pre-dawn darkness. These were people who had spent the night in St. Peter Port, sleeping in churches or on benches or simply standing in the streets, determined to be first aboard when the ships returned. Many had walked through the night from distant parishes. Thomas saw farmers in their workload, shopkeepers with their families, fishermen carrying elderly parents, teachers shepherding groups of children whose parents had already left or couldn't come themselves. The first ship appeared offshore at 6:30. It was a proper passenger ferry, the kind that normally ran scheduled service between the islands and England. Watching it navigate into the harbor, Thomas felt a surge of relief. Yesterday's ships had been adequate. This one was substantial. It could carry well over 1,000 people if loaded efficiently. The question was whether he and the other marshals could maintain order through the boarding process. As the ferry maneuvered toward the pier, Thomas assessed the crowd. Perhaps 800 people waited in the immediate area, with more arriving every minute. They were pressed together, but not yet pushing, anxious, but not yet panicked. The trick would be keeping them that way for the next several hours while the ship loaded. He thought about his father's dairy herd, how the cows would sometimes bunch up nervously at the barn door if they sensed a storm coming. The solution was never to force them through faster. Force created panic, and panic created chaos. The solution was to give them confidence that the door would remain open, that everyone would get through, that there was no need to push. Thomas climbed onto a wooden crate so the crowd could see him. "Listen to me," he called out, his damaged voice barely carrying. He whistled sharply, the way his father had taught him years ago, 2 quick blasts that could be heard across a field. The crowd quieted. "This ship can carry everyone you see standing in this harbor right now. Every single person, but only if we board in order. I'm going to divide you into groups of 50. Each group will have a number. When your number is called, you come forward, not before. If you push, if you try to board early, you'll slow everything down and people will miss the ship. Stay calm. Stay in your groups. And everyone gets to England today." He had no idea if the ship could actually carry everyone in the harbor. But the statement bought him credibility, bought him cooperation, bought him time to organize the boarding process. He began pointing to sections of the crowd, assigning them numbers, instructing group leaders to keep their people together. Sergeant Furbrash caught his eye from across the pier and nodded approval. The boarding began at 7 o'clock and continued through the morning. Thomas moved Group 1 forward 50 people, families with young children who needed extra time to navigate the gangway. Then Group 2, then 3. He maintained a steady rhythm, never rushing, never allowing gaps, keeping the flow constant. When someone stumbled or needed help, he detailed 2 younger men from the waiting groups to provide assistance. When an elderly woman became disoriented and confused, he assigned a teenage girl to stay with her until she was safely aboard. When twins got separated from their mother in the crowd, he halted the entire boarding process until they were reunited. By mid-morning, he had developed a system. Families boarded most efficiently if organized by age of children, infants, and toddlers first, then older children, then adults without children. He always kept siblings together. He watched for people who seemed too frightened or confused to follow instructions and assigned calmer evacuees to guide them. He learned to read body language, to spot the subtle signs of someone about to panic or collapse or cause problems, and to intervene before the situation escalated. It was, he realized with some surprise, exactly like working the dairy herd. Read the animals. Anticipate problems. Position yourself where you're needed. Never shout unless absolutely necessary. Move with confidence and others will follow. The principles were identical. Only the scale had changed. The first ferry departed at noon carrying approximately 1,300 people. Thomas had personally directed at least 400 of them aboard. His martial armband was soaked with sweat. His boots were scuffed from hours of standing on stone. His voice had deteriorated to a hoarse croak, but the evacuation proceeded without serious incident. No one had been injured. No one had been left behind who should have sailed. The pier had remained orderly from start to finish. There was no time to rest. A second ship was already approaching the harbor. Then a third was signaled as arriving within the hour. Sergeant Furbraugh estimated that if the ships kept coming at this pace, they could evacuate 5,000 people today alone, maybe more. The British government had apparently recognized the urgency and was diverting every available vessel to the Channel Islands. Ships that should have been evacuating troops from France were being sent to Guernsey instead. It was a massive commitment of resources, a tacit acknowledgement that the civilian population deserved the same rescue effort as soldiers. Thomas worked through the afternoon loading ship after ship. The crowd never diminished as fast as people boarded and departed. More arrived from the countryside. Some brought livestock chickens in crates, rabbits in hutches, even a few families with dogs on rope leashes. The marshals tried to enforce rules about animals, but the rules dissolved in the face of practical reality. People refused to board without their pets. Children screamed for their dogs. Elderly men wept over chickens that represented their entire livelihood. In the end, the animals went aboard too, packed into cargo holds and deck spaces, adding to the chaos but preventing worse problems. By evening, Thomas estimated he had helped evacuate more than 1,000 people, possibly 1,500. The numbers blurred together. What remained vivid were individual moments. A mother thanking him through tears as he lifted her children over a gap in the gangway. A farmer pressing a silver coin into his hand and refusing to take it back. A teacher leading 30 school children in a song as they waited their turn to board. An elderly couple holding hands as they walked up the ramp, never looking back at the island they were leaving forever. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The day that changed everything was June 21st, 1940. Thomas would remember it for the rest of his life as the day Guernsey emptied itself into the sea. He arrived at the harbor before dawn to find it already transformed. The crowd was no longer hundreds of people. It was thousands, perhaps 5,000 in the immediate harbor area, with long columns of evacuees stretching back through the streets into the blind darkness. The roads from every parish on the island were clogged with people walking toward St. Peter Port, carrying children in bundles, pulling carts, pushing wheelbarrows loaded with possessions. The British government had sent 25 ships. They arrived throughout the day in waves, filling the harbor until there was barely room to maneuver. Ferries, cargo vessels, converted steamers, coal ships scrubbed hastily clean. Passenger liners diverted from their normal routes. Anything that could float and carry people had been dispatched to Guernsey. It was the single largest evacuation effort the Channel Islands had ever seen. It was also, Thomas realized within the first hour, on the verge of complete breakdown. The scale overwhelmed the existing organizational structure. There weren't enough marshals. There weren't enough piers. There weren't enough hours in the day. And most critically, there wasn't enough time. Everyone in the harbor that morning knew, though few spoke it aloud, that this was likely the last large-scale evacuation opportunity. German forces were consolidating their control of northern France. Cherbourg had fallen. The Channel Islands were isolated and indefensible. If people didn't leave today or tomorrow, they probably wouldn't leave at all. That knowledge created pressure unlike anything Thomas had experienced. The crowd was no longer anxious. It was desperate. Parents shoved children forward, trying to ensure they got aboard even if the adults didn't. Elderly people stood aside voluntarily, insisting younger families take their places. Fights broke out over boarding positions. A woman fainted from standing too long in the sun. A man had what appeared to be a heart attack near Pier 3 and had to be carried away by volunteers. The orderly groups and numbered system that had worked so well on previous days dissolved under the sheer weight of humanity pressing toward the ships. Thomas found himself at the center of the worst bottleneck where 3 piers converged into a single plaza. Approximately 2,000 people were jammed into a space designed for perhaps 300. They couldn't move forward because the piers were already full. They couldn't move back because more people kept arriving from behind. They were trapped in place, growing more frightened by the minute, pressed together so tightly that children were being lifted off their feet by the compression of bodies around them. Thomas saw what was about to happen. He had seen it once before years ago at a livestock fair when too many cattle had been herded into too small a holding pen. One animal had panicked, tried to bolt, and triggered a stampede. 3 cows had died. 2 men had been injured, and that was with animals that weighed 800 pounds. These were people pressed together with nowhere to go, including children who could be trampled in seconds if panic took hold. He acted on instinct rather than thought. He pushed his way to the front of the plaza and climbed onto the stone wall that separated the harbor from the sea. It gave him height, visibility, and most importantly, a clear voice path to the crowd below. He placed 2 fingers in his mouth and produced the loudest whistle of his life, a piercing blast that echoed off the stone buildings and momentarily silenced the chaos. "Stop moving," he shouted. His voice was nearly gone, reduced to a rasp, but desperation gave it volume. "Everyone, stop moving right now." The crowd hesitated. Not stopped. There were too many people for that, but the forward pressure eased slightly. "We're going to clear this plaza section by section," Thomas called out. "If you're standing on my right side, everyone on my right, you're going to Pier 1. On my left, you're going to Pier 2 in the middle. You're staying here for Pier 3. Do not try to go to a different pier. The ships don't care which pier you board from. They all go to England. Choose the closest pier to where you're standing right now and commit to it." He was making it up as he went, inventing a solution to a problem he had no training for. But the crowd needed someone to tell them what to do with confidence. Even if the confidence was manufactured, especially if it was manufactured. "Pier 1, he shouted, pointing to his right. "Anyone standing on the right side of this plaza, start moving toward Pier 1. Slowly stay together. Marshals will organize you when you get there." To his amazement, they moved. Hundreds of people began flowing rightward, following his gesture, relieving pressure in the plaza. He immediately redirected the left side toward Pier 2. Then he focused on the remaining crowd in the center, breaking them into smaller groups, moving them forward in controlled waves. Other marshals saw what he was doing and began replicating it at other bottlenecks. Sergeant Ferber commandeered a megaphone and started directing traffic from the harbor master's office. Teachers and clergy who had been trying to organize school groups abandoned their individual efforts and began coordinating with the marshals. What had been chaos 15 minutes earlier began to resemble order, rough order, and perfect order, but enough order to prevent catastrophe. The evacuation on June 21st continued from dawn until well after dark. Thomas remained on the stone wall for hours, directing traffic, his arm aching from pointing, his voice completely gone by afternoon, so that he communicated solely through whistles and hand signals. Ships loaded and departed, and were replaced by new ships. The harbor filled and emptied and filled again. The sun moved across the sky and set, and still the ships kept coming, guided by harbor lights and desperation. Thomas lost count of how many people he helped evacuate that day. 1,000 certainly, possibly 2,000, perhaps more. What he remembered instead were fragments. The weight of a toddler he lifted over a gap in the Utai's gangway. The boy's mother too exhausted to manage it herself. The sound of a ship's horn as it pulled away from the pier, packed so densely that people stood shoulder to shoulder on every deck. The sight of a teacher leading 40 school children in a line, each child holding the shoulder of the one in front, moving like a single organism up a ramp onto a cargo vessel. And he remembered the silence that fell over the harbor near midnight, when the last ship of the day finally departed. The plaza was littered with abandoned belongings, suitcases that hadn't fit, clothing dropped in haste, children's toys left behind, but it was nearly empty of people. The thousands who had filled the harbor that morning were gone, evacuated, safe, on their way to England, and whatever future awaited them there. Thomas climbed down from the stone wall, his legs shaking with exhaustion. Sergeant Farah approached and gripped his shoulder. "You saved lives today, lad," the sergeant said quietly. "I've been in police work for 25 years. I've seen riots and disasters and things that would turn your stomach. What you did today, keeping the crowd calm when it could have turned into a massacre that took something special. I'm putting you in my report to the States. You deserve recognition for this." Thomas was too tired to respond. He simply nodded and began the long walk back to Castell through streets emptier than he had ever seen them. Guernsey felt like a different island now. Half its population was gone. The lights in houses that had burned every night for decades were dark. Farms that should have shown signs of evening activity were silent. The island was hollowing out, becoming a ghost of itself, preparing for an occupation that everyone now accepted as inevitable. The evacuation continued on June 22nd and 23rd, though at a reduced pace. Fewer ships arrived. Fewer people remained to evacuate. Most who had decided to leave were already gone. Those still waiting at the harbor were the last holdouts. People who had delayed the decision until the final moment. Families who had been separated and were trying to reunite. A handful of officials and volunteers who stayed to help others escape before escaping themselves. Thomas worked both days, his martial duties now almost mechanical. The desperate urgency of June 21st had passed. These final evacuations felt different, sadder somehow, because everyone involved knew they were abandoning the island to its fate. There would be no more rescue ships after this, no more chances to leave. Choose wrong now, and you live with the consequences for the duration of the war, however long that might be. On June 23rd, the regular mailboats and ferries were released from evacuation duty and resumed normal service. The official evacuation was over. Approximately 17,000 people had left Guernsey in 5 days, nearly half the island's population. 5,000 school children had been sent away, most without their parents. Entire families had scattered. Communities that had existed for centuries had fragmented. The social fabric of Guernsey had been torn apart by necessity and fear. Thomas walked through St. Peter Port on the evening of June 23rd and saw an island he barely recognized. Shops were closed, their windows dark. Streets that should have been busy with evening foot traffic were deserted. The harbor, which had been chaotic for 5 days, was quiet. A few fishing boats bobbed at their moorings. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries the only sound breaking the silence. It felt apocalyptic, like the end of a world. He returned to his father's farm to find it unchanged. The cows still needed milking. The tomatoes still needed tending. His father worked in the greenhouse as though nothing had happened, as though the island hadn't just evacuated half its population, as though German occupation wasn't days or hours away. Thomas joined him in silence, falling into the familiar rhythms of farm work, finding comfort in the normality of physical labor. Over supper that night, his father finally spoke about the evacuation. "Your mother and the children got out safely?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "They left on the 19th. I should be in England by now." His father nodded. "Good. That's good." He was quiet for a long moment, then added, "You did right, staying to help at the harbor. I heard stories about what happened there. People said you kept things from turning ugly. Said you knew how to manage crowds like you managed the herd." Thomas had never considered the comparison explicitly, but his father had grasped it immediately. Of course he had. His father understood animals and how they behaved under stress. He understood that frightened creatures, whether cows or people, needed calm guidance, not force. He understood that panic spreads through a group like disease, and that preventing panic is always easier than controlling it once it starts. "Reckon those are good skills to have in times like these?" his father continued. "Keeping people calm, keeping order." Thomas's farm became critically important. The Germans needed milk and dairy products. The civilian population needed whatever food they could get. Thomas found himself in the strange position of being valued by both occupiers and occupied. His farming skills suddenly elevated from ordinary to essential. He never forgot the evacuation. On quiet evenings, milking the cows or mending fences, his mind would drift back to those 5 days in June of 1940. He would remember the faces of children he had helped onto ships. He would remember mothers thanking him through tears. He would remember the weight of responsibility, the fear that he might make a mistake that would cost lives. The realization that skills learned in a barn and a pasture could matter during the worst crisis of his life. And he would think about the people who left. His mother and siblings reached England safely and spent the war years in the north of England, living with relatives Thomas had never met. They survived. His younger brother joined the British Army in 1943 and fought in France after D-Day. His sisters married Englishmen and never returned to Guernsey to live, though they visited after the war. His mother came back to the island in 1946 and moved back into the farmhouse, but she was changed. Everyone who lived through the occupation was changed. Of the 17,000 who evacuated, most eventually returned, but Guernsey never fully recovered the population it had before the war. Some evacuees died in England during the Blitz. Some found new lives and decided to stay. Some returned only to find their homes destroyed or their property confiscated and left again. The evacuation had saved lives, but it had also fractured a community in ways that could never be fully repaired. Guernsey was liberated on May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's unconditional surrender. Thomas was 26 years old, unmarried, still working his father's farm, still milking the same cows twice daily. The Germans left without resistance. British forces arrived to cheering crowds. The occupation was over. Life could return to normal. Except it couldn't. Normal no longer existed. The island had been transformed. The farms had been damaged. The harbor had been militarized. Thousands of people were displaced. And everyone carried the psychological weight of 5 years under occupation, 5 years of rationing and restrictions, of watching forced laborers die building fortifications, of living under the constant threat of arrest for the smallest resistance. Thomas married in 1947 and eventually inherited his father's farm. He raised dairy cattle for 40 years, expanded the operation, and modernized the facilities. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, and some did, especially historians documenting the evacuation, he described it simply. He had volunteered as a marshal, helped organize boarding, and kept crowds calm. The comparison to herring cattle he kept to himself. It seemed too humble, too ordinary to be the truth of what had happened. But it was the truth. A farm boy with no special education, no leadership training, no experience managing large groups of people, had helped evacuate approximately 8,000 civilians using techniques he learned working with dairy cattle. He had prevented panic in crowds that could have stampeded. He had maintained order during chaos that could have turned lethal. He had done it by reading the group, anticipating problems, positioning himself strategically, and communicating decisively exactly the way his father had taught him to move cows from field to barn. It was an absurd truth. It was also an extraordinary truth, because in June of 1940, when Guernsey needed help most desperately, when 17,000 people needed to evacuate an island before German occupation, the skills that mattered weren't military tactics or political authority or specialized training. The skills that mattered were patience and observation and the ability to keep frightened creatures calm when everything around them was collapsing. Those were skills Thomas Lameron possessed in abundance, and for 5 days, they were exactly what was needed. The harbor at St. Peter Port has been rebuilt multiple times since the war. Modern fees run regular schedules to England and France. The piers where Thomas stood directing evacuees have been replaced and modernized. The plaza where crowds pressed together in desperation is now a quiet parking area surrounded by shops and restaurants. Nothing visible remains of those 5 days in June of 1940, when half of Guernsey emptied itself into the sea. But the memory remains in official histories and personal memoirs, in interviews with survivors, and accounts passed down through families. The evacuation is remembered as both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because 17,000 people escaped before the bombing and occupation. Tragedy because 24,000 people stayed, including those who died in the June 28 raid, and endured 5 years of hardship under German rule. Thomas Laurent died in 1998 at the age of 79. His obituary in the Guernsey press mentioned his lifetime of farming, his service as a parish official, and his family. It included one paragraph about his volunteer work during the 1940 evacuation, noting that he had been commended by the States of Deliberation for helping maintain order at the harbor during the crisis. The obituary did not mention dairy cattle. It did not mention herring techniques, or barn management, or the patient skills learned from a lifetime of agricultural work. But his children knew, his family knew, and anyone who had stood in that harbor in June of 1940 and watched Thomas Lameron calm thousands of panicked people with a whistle and a gesture, they knew. They knew that sometimes the most important skills are the most humble ones. They knew that sometimes heroes are just ordinary men who show up when needed and apply whatever wisdom they possess to the problem in front of them. They knew that a farm boy's understanding of frightened animals could save thousands of lives during the most desperate hours of war. The evacuation of Guernsey stands as one of the remarkable civilian operations of World War II. 17,000 people moved from an island to safety in 5 chaotic days. Organized by volunteers with no experience in such operations, using ships diverted for military service, driven by fear of an enemy that arrived just days later. It succeeded not through brilliant planning. There was almost no planning, but through improvisation and determination, and the cumulative efforts of hundreds of people doing whatever they could to help. Among those hundreds, Thomas Lameron was not the most important. He held no official position. He gave no orders that changed the course of events. He was just a volunteer marshal, one of dozens, doing what he could with the skills he had. But his contribution was real. His impact was measurable. 8,000 people passed through the sections of harbor he managed. 8,000 people who might have panicked, who might have caused casualties through crushing or stampeding, who instead boarded ships calmly because someone who understood frightened creatures stood on a stone wall and showed them the way forward.